There are people who start well, but they end very badly. There are people who seem to have a bright and promising future, but their stories end in a melancholy and tragic way. Imagine someone to whom God gave a lot to your hands. Much, to be more accurate, someone who was raised by the Lord as a prince about his chosen people. A man whom God tore the kingdom of David's house and handed him. And then, after all this man managed to be worse than all who were before him. Someone who was so despicable to the point that his offspring be compared by God to a bunch of manure. The man we are talking about is Jeroboam, the first king of the northern tribes of Israel. Jeroboam. Its story could have been marked by glory and blessing from the Lord, but it became a narrative of tragedy and warning, so that it can be seen in the Bible as an example of how the disobedience and idolatry can destroy not only an individual's life, but also affect an entire nation. Thusly, for many Bible readers, the name of Jeroboam I is synonymous with apostasy and divine judgment. However, before we reach these conclusions, we need to understand Jeroboam's complete trajectory, from its performance during the reign of King Solomon, passing by its rise to the throne of the northern kingdom, to his sins, and the complete ruin of his dynasty due to God's judgment. And that's exactly what we'll talk about in this video. Jeroboam was an Ephraimite of humble origin, son of Naters and Azariah. Ephraim's tribe was one of the most influential among the northern, and Jeroboam tribes grew in a hard work environment and dedication. The Bible does not mention much about his family besides the fact that his mother was a widow, suggesting that Jeroboam may have faced difficulties early on. Already adult, Jeroboam stood out for his diligence, skill, and leadership. King Solomon recognized these qualities and designated him as the supervisor of the workers of Joseph's house. That is, the leader of the working group of the Ephraim and Manasseh tribes. One day, while Jeroboam was out of Jerusalem, the prophet Ahaz, the Silonite, met with him. There was dressed in a new cloak, and when he met Jeroboam, he tore the cloak into 12 pieces, handing 10 of them to Jeroboam. This symbolic action represented the imminent division of the kingdom of Israel. In this sense, Ahaz's prophecy was clear. God had decided to divide the kingdom of Israel because of Solomon's sins, which had deviated to idolatry, influenced by his many foreign wives. But God's message through Ahaz included an important and conditional promise. God promised that if Jeroboam would obey his commandments and follow his ways, as David had made, he would establish a lasting dynasty for Jeroboam. In other words, God promised to Jeroboam a firm dynasty in Israel, just as he had promised David. This was a promise of greatness and stability, but it was conditioned to obedience and faithfulness to God. The news of Ahaz's prophecy and the growing influence of Jeroboam reached Solomon's ears. Fearing a revolt and the loss of part of his kingdom, Solomon sought to kill Jeroboam. And to escape the wrath of the king, Jeroboam fled to Egypt, where he found refuge with Pharaoh. This escape to Egypt marked a period of exile and preparation, where apparently Jeroboam kept the right moment to return and claim God's promise. Then, after the death of Solomon, his son Rehoboam ascended to the throne of Israel. However, Rehoboam faced an immediate challenge. The northern tribes were dissatisfied with the heavy loads imposed by Solomon in their last years. For those who do not know, King Solomon even used the forced work of the Israelites themselves to build his kingdom majestic. This caused a growing dissatisfaction among the people. Jeroboam then returned from Egypt and joined the leaders of the northern tribes in search of a reduction in workload and taxes, appealing to Rehoboam for relief. Rehoboam asked 3 days to consider the issue and sought the council of elders who had served his father, Solomon. The elders advised Rehoboam to be a servant of the people, relieving their loads to gain their loyalty. However, Rehoboam ignored this wise counsel and chose to follow the guidance of young people who grew up with him, deciding to further increase the bales of the people. Obviously, Rehoboam's response was received with indignation. The northern tribes rejected their leadership, proclaiming that they had no inheritance in David's lineage. And with that, the 10 northern tribes broke with the Davidic dynasty, leaving Rehoboam with only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. It was in this context that Jeroboam was crowned king over the northern kingdom of Israel. After establishing his kingdom on the 10 northern tribes, Jeroboam concentrated efforts on the fortification of several strategic cities. This measure aimed to protect his kingdom against possible invasions and consolidate his territorial domain. Among the fortified cities were Shechem, in the mountainous region of Ephraim, where he initially established his capital, and Penuel, east of Jordan. The construction and fortification of these cities indicated Jeroboam's concern with the defense and security of his kingdom in the face of external and internal threats. The division of that kingdom did not result in a peaceful relationship with the southern kingdom. There was constant tension between Jeroboam, king of Israel, and Rehoboam, king of Judah. Rehoboam initially even planned a war to regain the northern tribes, mobilizing a great force military. However, he was dissuaded by Shemaiah, the man of God, who received a word from the Lord instructing him not to fight against his Israeli brothers. Nevertheless, minor conflicts continued to occur during the reigns of Jeroboam and Rehoboam. But after the death of Rehoboam, his son Abias climbed the throne of Judah, and the conflict between the two kingdoms persisted, culminating in a significant battle during the reign of Abias. According to the report of the second book of Chronicles in chapter 13, Abias faced Jeroboam in a great battle. The biblical text says that at that time Abias joined an army of 400,000 men, while the army of Jeroboam reached twice this number. Abias, trusting God's promise to the house of David, stated that the Lord was on the side of Judah. And though Jeroboam had a higher army, Abias inflicted a great defeat to the army of Israel, killing 500,000 Israeli men. But before that, Jeroboam might have still had to deal with the Egyptian threat to his territory. This is because during the reign of Jeroboam, Shishak, pharaoh of Egypt, he invaded the kingdom of Judah in the 5th year of Rehoboam. Shishak looted Jerusalem and took the treasures of the temple and the royal palace. Although the biblical account does not directly mention an invasion of Shishak to the kingdom of Israel under Jeroboam, Egypt is likely to have influenced and impacted both kingdoms. Even other historical sources point to Israeli cities among the places conquered by the Egyptian. Already in the last years of his reign, Jeroboam continued to govern with a focus on maintaining the power and stability of his kingdom. But his leadership was constantly marked by idolatry and disobedience to God. His reign was a period of spiritual and moral decline for Israel. Jeroboam reigned for 22 years, but his legacy was stained by the sins he committed and the idolatry he settled. In fact, to understand Jeroboam's tragic end, we need to consider the way idolatry developed under his government. King Jeroboam, fearing may the continuous pilgrimage of the people to Jerusalem to worship in the temple weaken their reign, took drastic measures to consolidate their power. He ordered 2 golden calves, telling the people that it was a lot of work for the Israelites to rise to the temple in Jerusalem. And those calves were the gods who took Israel out of Egypt. This reference to the Exodus, where Aaron made a golden calf while Moses was on Mount Sinai, was not just a strategic error, but a direct violation of the first and second commandments that prohibit the worship of other gods and the creation of sculpted images. Some Old Testament scholars argue that Jeroboam tried to implant in Israel the Mesopotamian worship to the calf of pre-Abrahamic days, just as Aaron had done in the desert. Then Jeroboam perverted the cult of the Lord and established 2 main worship centers in Bethel and Dan, strategically located in the south and north of his kingdom, respectively. Bethel had a significant spiritual history, being the place where Jacob had his view of the stairs to heaven. Edom was one of the northernmost cities of Israel. In doing so, Jeroboam diverted the focus of the worship of Jerusalem, the spiritual center designated by God. King Jeroboam not only created idols and centers of worship, but also violated God's orders about priesthood. He named the priests among all people and not just the Levites, the tribe designated by God to serve in the priesthood. Therefore, this action disregarded the divine ordinance and established an illegitimate priesthood, compromising the purity and holiness of the worship of God. In addition, Jeroboam instituted a party in the 8th month, on the 15th day, imitating the Tabernacles festival that was observed in the 7th month. This change in the date was not authorized by God and represented another effort by Jeroboam to create a parallel religious system, maintaining control over the people and driving them away from true worship prescribed by the Lord. Jeroboam's decision to establish these false cults was deliberate and well-planned. He reasoned that by providing places of more convenient worship, he would guarantee the loyalty of his people. However, this strategic plan ignored Jerusalem's centrality as God chosen for his temple, and the importance of following divine instructions on worship. But it is important to know that Jeroboam had the opportunity to convert from his bad way. God, in his mercy and righteousness, sent a prophet of Judah to confront Jeroboam and denounce his sins. This man of God, whose name is not mentioned in the scriptures, was tasked with going to Bethel, where Jeroboam was offering sacrifices on the altar he had built himself. Upon arriving in Bethel, the prophet of Judah cried against the altar by order of the Lord. He announced that a descendant of David named Josiah would be born and desecrated that altar, burning human bones on him. As a sign that his message was true, the prophet stated that the altar would crack and the ashes would pour out. When Jeroboam heard the prophecy, he reached out against the prophet and ordered him to be arrested. However, the king's hand dried himself, and he could not collect it. At the same time, the altar cracked, and the ashes poured itself, according to the word of the Lord uttered by the prophet. Frightened and humiliated, the man of God then prayed, and the king's hand was restored. This act of mercy contrasted with the message of judgment and revealed God's willingness to hear prayer and show grace, even in the midst of judgment. But then, about 300 years later, during the reign of Josiah, the prophecy pronounced by the man of God of Judah was fulfilled. Josiah, a reforming king, he performed a great purification in the territory of Judah and Israel. He destroyed the idolatrous altars and profaned the places of pagan worship. Josiah arrived in Bethel and burned the bones of the idolatrous priests on the altar instituted by Jeroboam, just as the prophet of Judah had predicted. Jeroboam's sin had devastating spiritual consequences for Israel. In introducing idolatry, he led the people to sin against God in a blatant and continuous manner. This removal from true worship has established a pattern of infidelity that lasted generations, contributing to the eventual fall of the northern kingdom. Even in the days of Jeroboam, the Lord announced through the prophet Aias the sloop, the fall of the northern kingdom, and the exile of its inhabitants because of idolatry. In the context of this prophecy, Jeroboam's tragic end was also declared. In fact, the biblical narrative of God's judgment on Jeroboam begins with the disease of his son, Abias. Worried about boy's health, Jeroboam sent his disguised wife to consult the prophet Aias in Silo. Perhaps Jeroboam had his conscience heavy for the sins committed and thought that if his wife disguised, the Lord's prophet could prophesy something positive about his family. Jeroboam's wife arrived at the house of Aias, but the prophet, although blind due to age, was warned by God about her arrival and the nature of her mission. The message Aias had for her was of judgment and condemnation for both Jeroboam and his family. In other words, the prophet was not deceived by the king's disguise and announced God's judgment on the house of Jeroboam. According to the biblical text, Aias delivered a tough and clear message. Because of Jeroboam's sins, and because he led Israel to sin, God would bring misfortune over his family. The prophet announced that all the men in his house would be exterminated, and that his descendants would be swept down as manure until there is nothing to remain. The prophecy still included an immediate signal. As soon as Jeroboam's wife came home and entered the city, her son Abias would die. And as announced by the prophet, it happened, and all Israel mourned for the boy. Abias was the only one in the house of Jeroboam to receive a decent burial. For in him was found something good to the Lord. The other members of Jeroboam's family would have their bodies devoured by dogs in the city or birds in the countryside, a sign of extreme humiliation and shame. In fact, the total destruction of Jeroboam's house was later fulfilled, when Baza from the tribe of Issachar conspired against Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, and killed him. Nadab had been the son who succeeded Jeroboam on the throne of Israel, but his reign lasted only 2 years. Baras exterminated the whole house of Jeroboam, thus fulfilling the word of the Lord pronounced by Aias. This event marked the end of the Jeroboam dynasty, the king who became known in biblical history as he who made Israel sin. The biblical text does not describe specifically how Jeroboam's death occurred, but it is assumed that this occurred shortly after the death of his son Abias. Another curiosity is that in the Old Testament's Hebrew text, the name of Jeroboam's wife is not quoted, but in a version of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, Jeroboam's story calls us to serious reflection on how the decisions we make, especially those involving our faithfulness to God, shape our history and impact those around us. We live in a time when integrity and faithfulness are constantly challenged by external and internal pressures. Thus, as we study Jeroboam's life, we must ask ourselves, are we looking for God's way, or are we leading by our own desires and fears? The story of Jeroboam and the judgment pronounced against him, they emphasize the righteousness of God. Although God is merciful and long-term, judgment about Jeroboam is a demonstration of God's holiness and his intolerance to sin. Jeroboam, as Israel's leader, had a responsibility to guide the people in the true worship of God. In instituting idolatry, he not only sinned personally, but led the whole nation to sin. This fact reminds us that spiritual leaders have a tremendous influence, and, when corrupted, can cause great spiritual damage. Then, in a way, the story of Jeroboam is also a warning to all leaders about the importance of remaining faithful to God and their commandments, as they will be charged more rigorously. But even in the midst of judgment, there is a glimpse of God's grace in the history of Jeroboam's house. Abias, the son of Jeroboam, was distinguished because in him was found something good for the Lord. This reminds us that God is able to discern and reward goodness, even in contexts of great iniquity. God's mercy is a constant theme in the Bible, offering hope of redemption even in the darker circumstances. Then God's judgment on Jeroboam and the subsequent ruin of his house are reminders of divine holiness and justice. Therefore, the history of Jeroboam teaches us about the seriousness of sin, the responsibility of spiritual leadership, and the importance of a life of faithfulness and obedience to the Lord. Now write in the comments if you already knew the story of Jeroboam. And if you want to grow even more in knowledge of God's Word, you can study theology with us totally online from anywhere through video lessons, handouts, and certificate of completion. The information is in the video description and the first comment fic. Tower of Babel has always been the subject of much speculation and curiosity on the part of the people. And many people don't know what the Bible really talks about it, and ends up believing in reports that have no biblical base. But in this video, we will know a little more about the Babel Tower in the light of the Bible. Even the expression of Babel does not appear in the Old Testament, but is the name popularly adopted to refer to the tower of the city of Babel. The word tower basically means watchman tower, while the word Babel comes from Babel and means God's gate for the combination of the Babylonian with the Hebrew Elate. But the name Babel is also explained by popular etymology based on a similar Hebrew root that means confusion and mixing, and has phonetic relations with the word Babel. It is certain that the name Babel became synonymous with the place of God's judgment, where there was the confusion of tongues and the beginning of idioms. But before we start talking about the Tower of Babel, we need to talk a little about the city of Babel. After the flood, God commanded man to spread and populate the earth. But, contrary to God's order, that population decided to unify, building a city in the Shinar Plain. The city of Babel is the first city mentioned in the Bible after the flood, and the region where Babel was built later became the so famous Babylon. And the city of Babel was founded by Nimrod, who also founded the cities of Erech, Akkad, and Calneh. And when Nimrod left for Syria, he still built other cities, among which was the city of Nineveh. And by the biblical account of chapter 11 of the book of Genesis, possibly Babel was the first headquarters of the government of Nimrod, and where his kingdom began. But along with the Babel building, those people also started building a tower to fortify the city. And that was a completely contrary attitude to God's will, because the construction of the Tower Babel basically meant the materialization of the refusal of God's command to spread and populate the earth. The expression applied to the Tower of Babel, whose summit touches the heavens, perfectly demonstrates the pride of that civilization, as well as the technological advance that humanity had already achieved at that time. The text of Genesis chapter 11 does not clarify whether these people were afraid of a new flood, but the city's structure, The grandeur of their tower and the insistence of a fully integrated society seem to indicate such a condition. If this is really what happened, then this behavior, besides characterizing disobedience to God, also exposed the lack of confidence in the promise the Lord had made. Because God had promised that the earth would never be destroyed by a flood. But how was the Tower of Babel built at that time? In the region of Babel, there were no stones that could be used as bricks, nor lime to be used as mortar. Then many buildings in that region were built with dried clay bricks in the sun or prepared in ovens. And the foundation of the buildings were also made of steppe clay, and the bitumen was used as mortar. The well-known Mesopotamian towers, called ziggurati, are used as references to understand how the shape of the Babel Tower was like. These towers were rectangular, built at levels, and accessible by stairs and ramps. They had a courtyard that gave access to the second floor, and other stairs, usually external, led to the top of the tower. Usually these towers had 3 levels, but there are indications of ziggurats with up to 7 levels. At the top of the tower, there was a sanctuary where the image of the divinity honored by the building of the ziggurat was. But these are just parameters. But we don't know how many levels the Babel Tower had, nor is it possible to know if in the Tower of Babel there was the function of sanctuary, because probably its building was unfinished along with the city itself when the inhabitants were dispersed. Similarly, it is also not known exactly where the Tower of Babel was built. Only the region where the city was, that is known. Because of this, there are some suggestions for the tower site. Some interpreters agree with the tradition transmitted by Jews and Arabians that the Tower of Babel was Nabu's temple, about 16 kilometers south of Babylon. This temple tower had 7 levels, and the main defense of this suggestion is that the name of this tower is possibly a variation of an expression that means Nimrod Tower. The second suggestion argues that the Tower of Babel was located in the city of Babylon and would be a well-known ziggurat whose name means the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. This construction was like a pyramid with steps. It was approximately 100 meters high. This construction was known in antiquity as the Tower of Babylon, and the inhabitants from that empire, they believed that the god worshipped by them descended in the tower temple to have contact with them. Subsequently, this tower was destroyed by Xerxes, and its rubble was probably removed by inhabitants from the region, and on site was only a huge crater. Other scholars argue that the Tower of Babel was west of Baghdad, Iraq. But this possibility is not much considered, especially because the city located in that region was built only in 400 BC. There is still a Jewish tradition that believes God sent fire from the sky and consumed the entire Tower of Babel, including his foundations, and it is impossible to locate it. And there is also another tradition that states that the Tower of Babel may have been overthrown by the force of the wind and that nothing is left of it. But if, on the one hand, it is not known exactly where the Tower of Babel was, on the other hand, it is possible to know the main information about it. Both the city of Babel and its tower represent concrete forms, the ambition of man since the earliest times. The Tower of Babel is a clear figure of the human insistence to disobey the Lord's orders. The most important biblical message about the Tower of Babel concerns the judgment of God that came upon that people, bringing the confusion of tongues and beginning the geographical dispersion of humanity, and the emergence of the various cultures and idioms. And in Genesis 11, verse 5, one can see an anthropomorphic element in the descent of God, to see the city and the tower that men were building in Babel. And in Genesis 11, verse 6, God then brought judgment over that people and spread him all over the earth. There is also a discussion if the confusion of languages was a global or local event. Some scholars argue that such an event occurred only within the Semitic history. Therefore, they understand. So soon the confusion of the tongues would have originated different dialects only among the Semites. But this interpretation is quite contested. The most accepted interpretation of Genesis chapter 11 is that the confusion of languages had a global impact. This means that humanity was concentrated there in Babel. So before that, everyone spoke the same language, which seems clear to the light of verses 1 and 6 of chapter 11 of the book of Genesis. Then it is possible that the author of Genesis used a method of text organization and construction where the first part of chapter 11 chronologically precedes chapter 10. This means that in chapter 10 it emphasizes Noah's descent and geographical divisions, while in chapter 11 he demonstrates how such divisions occurred with the dispersion of the human race. And finally, many people try to speculate what was the language spoken before the confusion of tongues in Babel. But this is another unanswered question. In fact, it is not known what the initial language was before the confusion of tongues in the Tower of Babel. Some scholars even suggest that this language was Hebrew. But there is no reasoning to defend this possibility, especially because the Hebrew language itself was originated from other dialects. And that is all that really is known about the Tower of Babel. Judges of Israel were God's chosen people, and especially endowed by him to judge and lead the Israelites. The time when these people led God's people became known as the Judges. And in this video, you will know who the Judges of Israel were, and will know the most important points of the period. The period of the Judges was the historical moment that consisted of the transition from the leadership of Moses and Joshua to the reign of the kings of Israel. And this period, of course, as its name implies, is described in the book of Judges in the Old Testament. The period of the Judges began with the oppression of the king of Arah, Mesopotamia, after Joshua and the elders died. And the people of Israel have surrendered to deep apostasy. By doing what was evil in the eyes of the Lord and worshiping strange gods, God allowed the king of Mesopotamia to subdue the people of Israel for 8 years. After this time, the Lord raised Othniel, a relative of Caleb, to free the Israelite people, starting the Judges period. As this period ended when Saul was elected king of Israel in approximately 1050 BC, most scholars understand that the Judges period lasted approximately 320 years. And in biblical history, it is easy to realize that the Judges of Israel were people raised by God in times of crisis, and these people were empowered by the Holy Spirit in a special way to judge and lead the people. Even in the book of Judges we read, "And lifted the Lord judges, who delivered them from the hand of those who stripped them." The judges remained in their duties until they die, and unlike kings, they did not establish a hereditary government in Israel. These judges were national heroes, and sometimes they are designated in the Bible as libertadores. And a list of the judges of Israel usually suffers some discussions. This is because some consider only the list of judges in the 12 cycles present in the book of Judges, with Samson being the last of them. Others also include Eli and Samuel in the official list of Judges of Israel. But in any case, he obviously and Samuel led and judged Israel before the institution of the monarchy, although not cited in the book of Judges. Another point that generates some discussion about the Judges period is the question of Deborah and Barak. Some scholars consider Deborah's leadership only, while others count Deborah and Barak separately as judges, and others unify their performance. And it is also interesting to mention that he and Samuel were most likely to be contemporaries of Samuel, at least for a while. And we know that Samson was the last judge mentioned in the book of Judges. The list of judges presented in the 12 cycles recorded in the Old Testament Judges book is as follows. The first judge was Othniel, a relative and son. Already the second judge was Ehud, a representative of the tribe of Benjamin, known for being a left-handed, who put an end in an 18-year period of oppression when he killed King Eglon de Moab. And after that, there was 80 years of peace. Then came Judge Sangar, son of Anat, whom the Bible speaks very little. All that is known is that he fought against the Philistines, even killing 600 Philistines with a guard of oxen. And the Bible doesn't say how long the Sangars lead. Then came Deborah's time, the only woman mentioned among the judges of Israel. Deborah was a prophetess who also judged the internal disputes of the people. But although not essentially a military leader, she had to go to the war against the army of Canaan King Jabin because of men's lack of confidence Israelites, especially Barak. And after the victory against the Canaanites, there were 40 years of peace. The fifth judge of Israel was Gideon, from the tribe of Manasseh, who fought heroically with his army reduced against the numerous Midianites, and gave Israel 40 years of peace. After Gideon came Tala, a man from the tribe of Issachar, who led Israel for 23 years. Then the seventh judge of Israel was Jair, an inhabitant of the city of Gilead, who judged the people for 22 years. The eighth judge of Israel emerged when the Israelites were being oppressed for 18 years by the Ammonites. Jephthah's leadership lasted 6 years, and he was also known for making one of the most controversial votes in the entire Bible when he promised his daughter in Holocaust. And if you want to know more about it, we have a video here on the channel talking specifically about the vote of Jephthah. Then finally appeared the last judge of Israel quoted in the book of Judges. His name was Samson, and he belonged to the tribe Dedan. Samson is one of the best-known biblical characters, especially because of his supernatural strength. He led the Israelites for 20 years and fought against the Philistines, but it is very difficult to be able to establish a chronology for the Judges period. This is because fundamental information is lacking for this task, such as the period of time that took place between the beginning of the conquest of Canaan with Joshua and the beginning of the king's oppression in Mesopotamia. There is also a great difficulty in interpretation of the sum of the numbers provided by the book of Judges. This is because by totaling the periods of oppression and government of the judges, one reaches a result that significantly exceeds the total period of total time for this moment, historical time for this moment. Therefore, we must understand that some periods of oppression and truce under the leadership of the judges have overlapped, so that it is not possible to determine how long there has been overlap in each specific case. And that means that there were probably periods when, while some tribes experienced a time of peace, other tribes, fixed in other regions of Canaan, faced some kind of oppression. But, considering all these difficulties, we can even risk an approximate chronology of the period of the judges of Israel. Thus, we can say that probably between approximately 1405 and 1364 BC, there was the government of Joshua and the elder Su. In some date near 1356, Othniel led Israel against the oppression of the king of Mesopotamia, and then there was a 40-year truce that lasted until at least 1316 BC Moabite oppression, and also, on a date near this period, the brief leadership of Sangar occurred. Then, at some point between 1258 and 1218 BC, the people of the 20 years of oppression of King Jabim, Deborah, and Barak, and the 40-year peace period in the north. Later, a 7-year-old Midianite oppression began, and then it was between 1211 and 1171 BC that Gideon released the Israelites and judged the people for 40 years. After this period, there was the perverse reign of Abimelech, son of Gideon, who became an unauthorized type of king in Shechem for a period of 3 years. Then, at some point between approximately 1168 and 1123 BC, there were leaders of Tola and Jair. And then the Ammonite people oppressed the Israelites for 18 years, until God raised Jephthah to free the people. Then, between approximately 1105 and 1074 BC, the judges Jephthah, Ibzam, Elam, and Abdon judged Israel. The final part of the Judges book also reports the 40th anniversary when the Israelites were under the oppression of the Philistines and the sanctioned power series that judged Israel for 20 years. And if we extend our chronology to the records of the first book of Samuel, thus reaching a date close to 1050 or 1030 BC, we have the record of capturing the Ark of the Covenant and the death of the high priest Eli, which also judged Israel at that time. And then we find the account of the Battle of Ebenezer and the registration of the prophet Samuel's leadership period, who culminated at the beginning of the monarchy with Saul's choice as the first king of Israel. Thank you for joining us on this enlightening journey at Path of Faith. Don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments below, give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video, share it with your loved ones, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content like this.